I still remember the smell of her lavender hand cream. It lingered on everything she touched, the doorknobs, the coffee cups, even the pages of the book she'd read late into the night. 3 years since Margaret passed, and I can still catch hints of it when the afternoon light hits our living room just right. You need to get back out there, Frank, my daughter Susan tells me every Sunday when she calls. Mom wouldn't want you sitting alone in that house forever. My son Michael says the same thing, though he's gentler about it. Even my neighbor Mrs. Patterson, who's been widowed herself for 15 years, keeps suggesting I join the singles group at the community center. They all mean well, I know that. But what they don't understand is that I'm not stuck. I'm not wallowing. I'm not even particularly sad most days anymore. I'm just living differently now. Margaret and I were married 58 years. 58 years. That's longer than some countries have existed. When you spend that much of your life with someone, moving on isn't like changing channels on the television. It's like asking someone to forget how to breathe. We met at a church dance in 1962. I was 21, fresh out of basic training, home on leave before shipping out to Germany. She was 19, wearing a blue dress that made her eyes look like pieces of the Atlantic Ocean. I asked her to dance to Moon River, and she said yes, but only if I promised not to step on her new shoes. I promised, then immediately stepped on them during the first turn. She laughed. Not a polite giggle, but a real laugh that came from somewhere deep in her chest. Well, she said, at least you're honest about being a terrible dancer. I knew right then I was going to marry her. People today, they don't understand courtship the way we did it. We wrote letters, real letters, with actual pen and paper. When I was stationed in Germany, Margaret wrote to me every single day for 2 years. Every day. I still have those letters, tied up with a yellow ribbon in the drawer of my nightstand. Her handwriting got more confident as the months went by, more sure of herself, more sure of us. When I came home in '64, we were engaged within a week, married 6 months later in the same church where we'd first danced. Our wedding photo sits on the mantel, Margaret in her grandmother's lace dress, me in my dress uniform, both of us grinning like we just won the lottery. And maybe we had. The early years weren't easy. I was working construction. She was teaching elementary school. We lived in a tiny apartment above Kowalski's Deli on 5th Street. The pipes froze every winter, and the summers were so hot we'd sleep on the fire escape with wet towels draped over us. But we were together, and that made everything else seem manageable. Michael came along in '67, then Susan in '69. Margaret quit teaching to stay home with them, which meant tighter budgets and longer hours for me. I remember coming home bone-tired from job sites, covered in dust and sweat, and she'd have dinner waiting. Not just food on plates, but candles lit, cloth napkins, the good plates we'd gotten as wedding gifts. Just because we're broke doesn't mean we have to live like we're broken, she'd say. She was right about most things. That was one of her more annoying qualities, actually. Margaret had a way of seeing situations clearly, without the fog of emotion or pride that clouded my judgment. When I wanted to quit my job and start my own contracting business, I was terrified. The steady paycheck, the health insurance, the safety of working for someone else. It all seemed too precious to risk. But Margaret sat me down at our kitchen table one evening in 1973 and pulled out a notebook. She'd been keeping track of every side job I'd done on weekends, every favor for neighbors that had turned into paid work, every compliment I'd gotten from homeowners. "Look at this," she said, pointing to columns of numbers in her neat handwriting. "You're already running a business. You're just letting someone else take most of the profit." So we took the leap, used our savings as a down payment on a used pickup truck, and had business cards printed at the copy shop downtown. Sullivan Construction, no job too small. Margaret designed the logo herself, a simple house outline with our phone number underneath. The first year was brutal. There were weeks when we lived on peanut butter sandwiches and canned soup. But Margaret never complained, never suggested I should go back to the safety of a regular job. She kept the books, scheduled appointments, and somehow made our little family feel like we were building something important together, not just scraping by. By the mid-'80s, we had 12 employees and more work than we could handle. We'd bought the house on Maple Street, where I still live now, with a big front porch and the oak tree in the backyard that Margaret always said looked like it was dancing when the wind caught it just right. The kids grew up, went to college, started families of their own. Michael became an accountant, moved to Phoenix with his wife and 2 daughters. Susan became a nurse, lives about 40 minutes from here with her husband and son. They visit regularly, call often, and worry about me constantly. But Margaret and I, we settled into the rhythm of a long marriage. Coffee together every morning at 6:30, reading different sections of the newspaper and sharing interesting bits. She'd do the crossword puzzle. I'd check the sports scores and weather. We'd plan our days, discuss what needed doing around the house, coordinate schedules for doctor appointments and social obligations. Evenings were for television. We both loved Jeopardy and would shout answers at the screen, keeping informal score of who got more right. Margaret usually won. After the news, we'd read in bed, her mystery novels and my history books, until one of us got drowsy enough to turn off the lamp. It sounds mundane when I describe it like that, boring even. But there was something profound in that everyday rhythm, something that felt like the deepest kind of love, not the passionate, desperate love of our youth, but something steadier and more durable. Love that didn't need constant declaration or grand gestures, because it was woven into the fabric of every ordinary day. Most people walk away when stories get this heavy. The fact that you're still listening, that means something. When Margaret got sick, really sick, not just the usual aches and pains that come with getting older, she was 74, pancreatic cancer. The doctor, a young man who looked like he should still be in high school, sat us down in his office and explained the diagnosis with careful clinical language that somehow made it sound both devastating and routine. "How long?" Margaret asked. She was always direct like that, never one to dance around difficult subjects. With treatment, possibly 18 months. Without it, maybe 6. Margaret reached over and took my hand. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was firm. "What kind of quality of life are we talking about?" The doctor explained chemotherapy, radiation, the side effects, the likelihood of success. Margaret listened without interrupting, asked practical questions about timing and logistics. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "I'd like to go home and think about it," she said finally. We drove home in silence. That evening, sitting in our living room with cups of tea growing cold on the coffee table, Margaret looked at me with those ocean blue eyes that had barely faded over the decades. "I don't want to spend what time I have left feeling sick from treatments that probably won't work anyway," she said. "I want to spend it feeling like myself for as long as possible." I wanted to argue. I wanted to fight for every possible day, every treatment option, every slim hope the doctors might offer. But I'd learned over 50+ years that when Margaret made up her mind after careful consideration, she was usually right. So we chose time over treatment, quality over quantity. We told the kids, which was the hardest conversation of our lives. Susan cried and begged us to reconsider. Michael went silent for days, then called back with a list of specialists and second opinion doctors he'd researched online. But Margaret had made her choice, and I supported it. We spent her last 18 months living as normally as possible. We took a trip to Ireland, something we'd always talked about but never gotten around to. We visited old friends, organized family gatherings, and made sure our affairs were in order. Margaret faced her death the same way she'd faced everything else in our life together, with dignity, practical planning, and a refusal to let fear make decisions for her. Those final months weren't all sadness and preparation. There were mornings when Margaret felt strong enough to work in her garden, afternoons when we'd sit on the front porch and watch the world go by. She taught me how to cook her meatloaf recipe, the one I'd been eating for decades but had never bothered to learn. "You're going to need to feed yourself," she said with characteristic directness. The night she died, we were in our own bedroom, in our own bed. Hospice had set up equipment, and Susan was sleeping in the guest room down the hall. Margaret had been unconscious for most of the day, her breathing shallow and irregular. Around 3 a.m, I felt her squeeze my hand, just once, very gently. When I looked at her face, her eyes were open, looking directly at me. "Thank you," she whispered, So quietly I almost missed it. Those were her last words. Thank you. Not goodbye, not I love you, though both of those were understood. Thank you for the 58 years, for the choices we'd made together, for supporting her decision about how she wanted to die. She passed away about an hour later while I was holding her hand and humming Moon River under my breath. The funeral was exactly what Margaret had planned. Simple service at our church, burial in Greenwood Cemetery, next to the plot she'd already picked out for me. Lots of flowers, lots of friends and family, lots of stories about the woman who'd been the center of my world for most of my adult life. And then everyone went home, and I was alone in our house for the first time in nearly 6 decades. The first few weeks were the hardest, not because of the grief. That was expected, manageable in its own way, but because of the silence. Margaret and I had filled our house with conversation, with the comfortable noise of two people sharing space. Without her voice, the house felt cavernous and strange. I started talking to her picture, not in a crazy way, but just sharing my day the way I always had. The Hendersons got a new dog, I'd say, looking at her photo on the mantel. Golden retriever puppy. Cute little thing, but it's going to dig up their whole yard before summer's over. People started visiting more frequently. Susan came by twice a week. Michael called every few days. Friends from church brought casseroles and stayed for coffee. Mrs. Patterson from next door kept finding excuses to check on me, and slowly, carefully, they all started suggesting that I needed to move forward. Dad, you can't live in the past, Susan said one afternoon while we were sorting through Margaret's clothes. Mom wouldn't want you to. There are some lovely women at the senior center, Mrs. Patterson mentioned over the fence while we were both working in our gardens. Widows who understand what you're going through. Maybe it's time to sell this big house, Michael suggested during one of his phone calls. Get something smaller, easier to maintain. Maybe one of those active adult communities where you'd have more social opportunities. I understand what they're trying to do. They see a lonely old man rattling around in a house full of memories, and they think the solution is to help me start over, find new companionship, new routines, new purposes. What they don't understand is that I'm not stuck in the past. I'm carrying it with me, which is different. There are more stories I need to get off my chest. If you want to hear them, hit subscribe. I'll be here. Every morning I still make coffee for 2 out of habit, then drink both cups while reading the newspaper. I still do the crossword puzzle, though I'm not nearly as good at it as Margaret was. I still watch Jeopardy in the evenings, still shout answers at the television screen. But I'm also learning new things. I've started cooking more than just Margaret's meatloaf recipe. I joined a volunteer program at the VA hospital, reading to veterans who can't see well enough to manage books themselves. I've been teaching my grandson how to use basic tools, the same way my father taught me 60 years ago. I'm not waiting to die. I'm not frozen in grief. I'm living a life that honors what Margaret and I built together, while also acknowledging that I'm the only one left to live it. When people tell me I should move on, I think they mean I should pretend that 58 years of marriage can be packed away like Christmas decorations, stored in the attic until some future time when it might be appropriate to take them out and remember. But a life shared that deeply doesn't work that way. Margaret isn't my past. She's woven into everything I am now. When I see a cardinal at the bird feeder, I remember how she always said they were good luck. When I smell lavender, I think of her hands. When I hear Moon River, I remember that first dance and the promise I broke about not stepping on her shoes. Moving on would mean cutting away parts of myself that I'm not willing to lose. Instead, I'm moving forward. With Margaret's influence still guiding my decisions, her voice still part of the conversation in my head when I'm trying to figure out what to do next. I'm not dating, not because I'm opposed to companionship, but because I'm not lonely in the way people assume I must be. I'm complete in a way that includes loss, that incorporates the empty space where Margaret used to be, and finds meaning in that emptiness rather than trying to fill it with something else. 3 years isn't very long in the context of a 58-year marriage. 3 years is still learning how to be the only person responsible for remembering our shared jokes, our private language, our history together. 3 years is just beginning to understand how to carry forward the best of what we were, while building something new from what I am now. Maybe someday that will change. Maybe 10 years from now, or 15, I'll meet someone who makes me want to share coffee and crossword puzzles again. But right now, I'm exactly where I need to be. Not stuck in the past, not rushing toward some prescribed future, but living fully in the present moment that includes everything Margaret and I were together. When I look at her photo on the mantle, I don't see an ending. I see a continuation. The woman who taught me that love doesn't die when people do. It just changes form. It becomes memory, influence, the foundation for whatever comes next. So to everyone who thinks I should have moved on by now, thank you for caring. Thank you for worrying. But I'm exactly where I belong, carrying forward the best love story I've ever been part of, one ordinary day at a time.